So in the last video, in this little part of the series where I'm trying to piece together kind of the history of thought in Western civilization, all within my Jordan Peterson project, we talked about René Descartes and his, I'm probably butchering that, sorry, all you Frenchmen. I talked about Descartes and this epistemological individualism, this turn in towards the self, and where I can find certainty is in myself, and that has deep ramifications. In a sense, the West has become a salad bowl of beliefs. I read an article today. Well, part of what's difficult about sussing out the beliefs and evaluating others in a fair way is that there are so many mixtures of beliefs now in the Western menu, that if you can look at someone and say, well, he's got this in his background, he's got an element of this, therefore he ought to be taken off the stage. Well, we've all got so many different elements from the menu on our plate, and well, Christianity killed people, and capitalism kills people, and socialism kills people, and yeah, people kill people. That's what they all have in common. So at some point, you want to pull back a little bit and say, well, let's get a little higher resolution view of what's going on here and see what's happening. And so these two little videos are intended for us to take a little bit of stock of some of our assumptions about what we are and how we think and how we evaluate. Now is this in the service of skepticism? Well, skepticism can sometimes be a good tool in terms of helping to make us humble. So I'm continuing with Philip Carey, and he's continuing on in this chapter 17 in Philosophy and Religion in the West, and now we're turning from Descartes to Locke.
Individualist. I think this epistemological individualist, John Locke, will be a bit more familiar, will sound a bit more like ourselves. John Locke now is working toward the end of the 17th century. He's an empiricist, as opposed to Descartes. Like Locke,
now again, he's an empiricist, and we've been working this. I just have a bunch of slides up here to. We've been working this, and so we're after the Protestant Reformation. We no longer trust texts. We no longer can locate the authority in the church. The Protestant attempt at locating authority in the text, that's got its detractors. The Protestants, took away from locating the authority in the church. That's got its detractors. And so now we come to Locke.
Locke, like Descartes, he's an epistemological individualist, but he's an empiricist, which means he starts not with reasoning, as a rationalist does, like Descartes, but he starts with experience. Experience here means sense experience, the kind of experience that you base physics on. It doesn't mean necessarily religious experience. In fact, it doesn't mean religious experience at all. It means the experience of the senses. It means observation. It means what you can see using seeing, hearing, touching, taste, or smell. Now, Locke thinks that our sense experience can give us no access to the essence of things, right? We see the outside of things, as it were, with our senses. This is quite in contrast to Aristotle, who thought that beginning with sense experience, you could actually get to know the essence of things, that Aristotelian form which is embodied in things. For Locke, we cannot know the inner essence of things. All we have is sense experience of them. We can know how they behave in the sensible world. So once again, it turns out, there's a certain worry about solipsism. And here's how Locke expresses that worry. It's as if our minds are a private inner room. And we have 5 windows, the 5 senses. And through those 5 senses, images can come into this little dark room. The room is actually like a camera. The Italian name for it is camera oscura, dark chamber, from which we get our word camera. Imagine a camera that's the size of a room, and let's suppose there's only one aperture. It works like a lens. What happens is the images from the outside world are projected on the back wall. just as they are on the film of a camera, right? Now imagine you're inside this room, and all you can see is the images projected on that back wall. You don't even get to look out the window. Right? For Locke, that's what it's like being a human being.
Okay. Now we want to jump a little bit ahead to Jordan Peterson, because Peterson, if you listen to Peterson, Peterson obviously has the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of Kant, who's going to deal with some of these issues. And so Peterson will say, yeah, but the room isn't empty. In some ways we're in a room and we're trapped with our experiences, but that we're not a blank slate, and human beings are not just simply constructed by their sense experience. We, through the process of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, already have all kinds of things built into us. And this is where we get into, why are chimps afraid of snakes? Why can human beings see so well? And all of these kinds of things. But we're at the point yet with Locke, and but I just wanted to make that contrast.
All you're seeing is images of the world, images from the five senses, sounds, sights, smells, all inside that private inner room. We never get to get outside the room, right? It's as if we don't really touch the world, right? Our body touches the world, but our mind receives images of that touch in that inner world. So there's this profound inner isolation, which again haunts the modern mind. Well, if we only know the outside of things in the external world, and we ourselves are living in this inner world, it turns out then that we don't really have much in the way of scientific knowledge or certainty for Locke, in contrast to Descartes. In fact, Locke's main interest is not with scientific knowledge, but with belief. And here's another specifically modern problem. Imagine now you're in a world where Catholics and Protestants believe that the other person's going to get damned if they don't agree with you, right? If you're a Catholic, you believe Protestants are going to get damned if they don't share Catholic belief, and Protestants return the favor. And in fact, in many countries, if you're the wrong religion, you will get penalized. In England, for instance, if you were Catholic, you'd have a hard time getting your children educated, right? So you can be punished both on earth and in heaven, or in the Last Judgment, for having the wrong beliefs. Everybody's worried about this. This is a source of great anxiety. If you got the wrong beliefs, things go wrong with you, maybe eternally wrong with you. So the notion is there are certain duties about how we believe, right? There's a point to having what's called an ethics of belief. Because if you have the wrong beliefs, you can be blamed for it. You can be held responsible for it. You can be held eternally responsible for it.
Now this is a vital turning point, and this is a vital point in terms of belief. And now we're engaging in questions about Peterson's pragmatism. Are we judged by what we believe or by what we do? Now ironically, I think a careful reading in the New Testament, because the Old Testament deals with afterlife and judgment in a very different way from the New Testament, but a careful reading of the New Testament again and again says that we're judged by what we do. Now that's really interesting. And so, but at the same time, Jesus very much is dealing with people's beliefs. And if you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be saved. Well, what does that mean? And when Peterson is asked, what does it, are you a Christian? Do you believe in God? And Peterson wants to back up the train and says, now, wait a minute. What do you mean by believe? So what's interesting here is that if you look at what is happening with Locke and what is happening in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, and if you look at the way Protestants deal with this idea of belief, well, there's a lot to think about here. There's a lot to talk about here. And once your resolution gets a little bit higher, then we have to ask questions about belief and action. And we have to ask questions about what does God require of our belief. Part of what's interesting in the Jordan Peterson conversation is that usually religious traditionalists will come to Peterson and, well, we want you to believe this. Oh, okay. So what? And one of the places we've come to in our contemporary conversation with the question of the possibility of the new tyrannical left is unless you believe certain things about certain people, or one of the issues that is going on with respect to Christian colleges and the same-sex marriage debate is, are Christians allowed to have their own ideas about God's opinion of some marriages with respect to others? Well, how do we sort this out? Well, does this actually play out in discrimination, like who are you going to bake a cake for and not? All these ideas hit the ground in some important ways in our present conversation, and they go back to Locke. And in many ways, a lot of the assumptions that we carry around in our head about good, bad, right, or wrong, about ought, goes back into this philosophical tradition, whether or not you've ever heard the name John Locke. And let's not, well, just a little important historical tidbit. One of Locke's biggest disciples was Thomas Jefferson. And if you do a fair amount of reading about Locke, and then you read the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson penned, well, Jefferson's following Locke. Well, how does that play in? Now we're going to deal with, Jefferson's deism and Jefferson's. Now, Paul, why are you going into all of this? I want some of this background. This is prolegomena before we get to C.S. Lewis, because these issues of natural and supernatural, these issues of belief, these issues of, well, why do people who have seen a ghost not believe in ghosts? These questions about beliefs are very complicated. And so when Peterson says, well, it depends what you mean by believe. Well, if you know a little bit of something about the history of belief, you can say, yeah, that's a worthwhile thing to talk about.
So what Locke does in this situation of anxiety about belief is propose a way of governing our belief formation, a way of governing how we make our beliefs. We're supposed to form our beliefs in a way that is rational, right? And here's where reason comes back for Locke. And we're supposed to do our best so that our beliefs are true. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to be held responsible for whether our beliefs are actually true for Locke. For Locke, the notion is, if you do your best to make your beliefs true, then no one can blame you for not doing any better. So,
and that no one can blame you includes God. And so, when I talk to people, okay, you're a Christian pastor, you believe in hell and all of this stuff, yeah. Well, I think people are being sincere and doing their best. Oh, okay. Well, in what way do we accept that standard, and in what ways do we not accept that standard? Well, God can't blame people for not believing what they haven't had a chance to not believe. I think there's a lot of validity to that answer, but it's important to back up and look at that answer. And in fact, when I say we have to back up and look at that answer rationally, well, again, I'm being an heir of John Locke, because this is exactly the habit that permeates our culture. And now if we're dealing with people from other cultures, especially people from traditional cultures whose background goes, hasn't traveled through Locke, or if you engaging in conversation with, let's say, someone from a Roman Catholic tradition that bears some of the pre-Lockean things in their culture versus a Protestant that has a lot of this stuff embedded within the culture and their beliefs of their church, these conversations get complicated.
So Locke proposes a way of doing your best to make your beliefs true. And then even if your beliefs aren't true, you've done your best, you've done your duty, and no one can blame you. So, how would we do this? How do we do our best? And notice, again, this is individual, right? How do I, as an individual, do my very best, right? And Locke will insist it's not by believing what other people tell you. It's not by reading the text of the tradition. It's not by reverting to authority or tradition.
Now pause there, because go and look up Steve Jobs' famous commencement speech at Stanford. What did he tell people to do? Don't believe authority. Don't believe what others tell you. Follow your own inner guide. Where are we getting this from? Well, did you think this all by your own self, Steve Jobs? No. This stuff is in the water. You picked this up from Descartes and Locke. So if you practice what you preach, are you allowed to follow Descartes and Locke? I mean, again, this stuff is all out there, and it just passes in our culture for nothing.
Tradition. You've got to figure this out for yourself, right? That's the key theme of epistemological individualism. You have to figure it out for yourself, not rely on tradition or authority. Well, how do you do that for Locke? Well, what you do is adopt a program that has been called evidentialism. And the idea is you're going to try to figure out which of your beliefs have the strongest evidence, and you proportion the degree of your belief to the degree of the evidence. You're not allowed to believe something more strongly than the evidence allows you to believe it. That's the key proposal. Makes sense, right? Seems almost obvious, but it was a new proposal. Right? No one had proposed quite this sort of thing before Locke.
And think about that. I mean, just think about that. This thing that is so self-evident to us from a very early age, something we had picked up. And this, again, is how Peterson has been helping me in terms of thinking about, well, how did I learn this stuff? Well, these little sub-Paul Vanderklays in my Jungian cloud of witness were watching everyone, and you know, you talk about developmental psychology. I picked this stuff up. I never examined its credentials. And that's the amazing thing about evidentialism, is that so many of us in the West have simply picked this stuff up without examining its credentials, which is the key tenet of this evidentialism.
And that's because no one had supposed that individuals are supposed to assess the evidence for beliefs. So, what you're going to do for Locke is you collect all these beliefs and you see how one belief is dependent on another. You know how this works with science, right? One sort of observation is evidence for a theory, and the theory is based on the evidence. And for instance, if you're a scientist, you're not going to accept a theory if it doesn't have any evidence, right? You'll say, oh, that's an interesting hypothesis, but let's test it by the evidence, right? So in effect, what Locke is doing is saying, let's adopt this standard of scientific evidence for all of our beliefs and say we don't have a right to our beliefs unless we have evidence for them, right? That makes perfect sense in science.
We don't have a right for our beliefs unless there's evidence for them. And like he says, that makes perfect sense for us in science, but
in science, you don't want people adopting scientific theories with no evidence at all. But it's a very high standard for ordinary beliefs. For most of our beliefs, we believe what we're told. You open a map and you say, oh, Montana's over here. I've never been there. I've never seen it myself, but I'll believe what the map tells me, right? What kind of evidence do you have for that? Well, you believe in what you're told. You believe in what's written in a kind of text. So evidentialism is a very high standard, and it would mean that a lot of our beliefs are not well-grounded, and we don't really have a right to them because we haven't seen the evidence for ourselves.
Now, an important pause here that you can stop and say, you don't really have a right to them. We've introduced an ought into this conversation. We have. We've introduced an ought into this conversation, and that's kind of a funny thing. And we've kind of introduced it into the conversation, and we don't really know why. Now, as I mentioned in the video I did on Peterson and and biblical interpretation, well, we've brought this ought into the conversation, and again, part of where I'm going to go is following my old philosophy teachers, Nick Waltersdorf and Alvin Plantinga. I never actually had a class with Alvin Plantinga, but he and Waltersdorf at Calvin College worked on this stuff. You let that ought in. That ought to be there. How ought we to evaluate this ought? And this is often, if doubt is a good habit to bring into some conversations, part of what I've developed is that anytime someone puts an ought on me, I say, all right, well, you're an evidentialist, prove that ought. And part of the difficulty that people are increasingly having now in the postmodern world, and Peterson brings this out beautifully with respect to what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism, is, wait a minute, your presupposition says you can't have an ought, but you're putting this ought on me. Ought yourself, and leave me out of your ought, and I'll work on my own oughts, thank you. But now I'm an individualist in this, and ought I to be one of those? And you begin to see, oh my goodness, this business of picking and choosing and being my own master of myself is fraught. The more I know, the more I realize how fraught it is. Well, what am I going to do with myself?
So Locke is proposing that this evidentialist criterion should be the way we judge our beliefs. And in particular, we proportion the degree of our belief, the strength of our belief, to the strength of the evidence. We could use a new term at Locke's time and say we proportion the strength of our belief on the strength of the probability of what we believe. Probability is actually a new term, or rather it's an old term with a new meaning, because in the Middle Ages, if you said something was probable, what you meant was that some authority said it was true, and therefore that gave you probable reason to approve of it. The word probable comes from a Latin word meaning approve. Well, the modern notion, of course, is quite different. It's assessments of probability. You know, if you flip a coin 10 times, there's so much probability of it turning up heads so many times, and so on. That's a new notion, develops at about the same time as Locke, and is keyed into this notion of evidentialism. All right. Well,
now this probability. Now, when we get into the Metaphysical Club, which I probably won't pull it up, I was just working on pulling it up, get into the Metaphysical Club, and you get into some of these pragmatists who are actually developing the mathematical basis of doing statistics and probability, and using this to find stars that their tools are not yet able to that don't have the accuracy specific to locate the stars, but they can with math then find the stars to a sufficient degree to have it be useful to them. So now when we look at these tools of Locke, we should say, I think again Peterson is right with this, is this useful? And I would say, yeah, Locke is very useful, and this evidentialism is very useful, and this is and Descartes' doubting these are all very useful tools. But at some point we should recognize that these are tools and embrace them as tools, but also keep them as tools and not let them be our masters. Well, all of this is in the search of a master, and to ask for, see, and I'm not even sure foundational is the right way to go, because as I said in my past video when I talked about Peterson and his concordism with respect to, well, shoot, there's a paradise here, and I find that works for my chaos and order. Shoot, monkeys, we have this great eyesight, so we can watch patterns in snakes, and we have color vision, so we can see fruit. And here we have this Genesis story where there's a woman who is nature, and she selects, and we've got all of these things. Yeah, well, the game is afoot here, boys and girls, and to me, again, this is terribly fun stuff, and Peterson is bringing a lot of this stuff together, and it's part of the reason he's so engaging. And let's approach these things as tools, and again, you might ask, well, why? How does this fit into your Calvinism? Well, here's there's a certain freedom in Calvinism where I take some of the ought off me, because part of what will follow Locke will be, I don't want to get too deep into Calvinist schisms, but the Calvinist Arminian or the Gomorist Remonstrant conflict that gets then spelled out into the Canons of Dort, which is a very controversial document. But what does it mean that I am not my own? What does it mean if I, in the context of this modern, of our contemporary frame, realize just how constructed I am? And I should probably look at that Schirmer-Peterson, or maybe treat that Schirmer-Peterson video, because I thought that was really an excellent conversation. I had a very low resolution picture of Schirmer, and my resolution was increased considerably by listening to his conversation with Peterson. And Schirmer was an ex-Christian who gave up the faith, and but as a Calvinist, what's easier for me is to believe that I am not my own, and to believe in a God of providence who brings me to this point. And I believe that finally, while I am judged on what I do, I am aware enough of my own construction via genetics, my own construction via history, my own location, that obviously I was not responsible for Stan and Barb, bringing me to life in Peterson, New Jersey in the 1960s. I mean, I wasn't responsible for any of that. So how on earth can I be a being that the God of the universe would look upon and engage with and have a purpose for? Now we're into meaning, and this would all mean something. Oh. Okay, so I'm not afraid of Locke, and I'm not afraid of Descartes, and I can understand how these things come and make me, and I can believe in a God that would understand all of this at far higher resolution than I ever could, and I can even believe that this God isn't just an idea of God, which is clearly operating. Idea of Santa Claus operates in this world and affects things, but that in fact this all could be part of an ontological story that, even if I'm wrong in my belief, I'm justified in believing it, even as Locke is trying to construct justifications for belief. And again, at some point I'll probably have to get into Waltersdorf and Plantinga on faith and rationality, because what Locke is constructing here, in a sense, Waltersdorf and Plantinga are going to deconstruct.
Well, this notion of evidentialism, of proportioning your belief to the evidence, is so familiar to us nowadays that it's hard for us to realize that it was a new idea in Locke's time, and it had new consequences. Let's look at two key consequences of Locke's picture of religion, his picture of epistemological individualism. First of all, to go back to that dark inner room. This notion of an inner self, we've encountered it before. This notion of a private inner world is present in Augustine, for instance. But in Augustine it's different, and this is an interesting feature of the modern notion of the inner self. Augustine's inner world is private, it's your own individual space, but it's open above to the light of God. It's like a palace in a courtyard, or a courtyard in a palace, with no roof. The light of the divine sun is shining from above, right? So you go inward, you look upward, and you can see God. So the inner self becomes a place where you can go to find God. It's not like that in Descartes. It's a dark inner room. It's not like that in Locke. It's also not like that in Descartes as well. It's a dark inner room. You go into that inner space of the self, and there is a roof. Right? There's no light coming except from the senses. So the inner space of the self is not a place to go to see God. It's a place where we're stuck. Right? We cannot but stay inside this inner self. All we can see is images from the senses. We do not have an inner light, a light of God shining. There were people in Locke's time who thought that they had an inner light. Quakers and other enthusiasts, Locke called them. That was a traditional term. Actually, it's a funny thing. Enthusiasm was a bad word for Locke and many of his respectable Anglican friends. Enthusiasm was a word for people who thought, oh, God talked to them in their dreams, or they had an inner light, or it meant something like fanaticism, right? Religious fanaticism. Enthusiasm is for holy rollers, those kind of people that we respectable Anglicans don't like. So Locke, I think, deliberately wanted to put the roof on the private inner self.
Now there's so much that goes into that. Number one, why do I kvetch when Peterson talks about divine spark? Divine spark is Quaker language. It's not just a dispute between Quakers and maybe it is a dispute between Quakers and Calvinists. But notice here the contrast between Augustine and Locke. Also now, Jonathan Edwards, for those of you who know a little bit of American church history, in the Great Awakening, will defend enthusiasm. And so in the Great Awakening, you have these wild religious experiences. And part of what's being interesting about the Jordan Peterson conversation is Jordan Peterson doing enough talk about psychedelics and experiences a la Jung. That, this is on the table in the Jordan Peterson community, but this is very much on the table with Jonathan Edwards, and Jonathan Edwards takes a very interesting position with respect to enthusiasm, where Jonathan Edwards has these experiences, but yet has them and defines them in a certain way where they have credibility, because Jonathan Edwards in a sense calls the prim and proper Anglicans on their cultural biases and prejudices, and says, okay, read the Bible. There's lots of crazy stuff and people having crazy experiences in the Bible. All you Englishmen who are so prim and proper, watch, think about your own biases in this. And of course, Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest philosophers and theologians that came about in the English colonies in the Americas.
Self. Precisely so that people like Quakers who claim to have an inner light could be shown to be irrational, could be shown to be governing their beliefs in a way that was irresponsible. Right? These people shouldn't be believing this stuff. Right? So, where do we get evidence for religion? Well, for Locke, we get it mainly from the miracles of the Gospels, right? The religion, of course, for which Locke wants evidence is Christianity. He looks for the evidence in the miracles of the Gospels. He takes that to testify to the truth of what is proclaimed in the Gospels and also in the prophets of the Old Testament. And that's his evidence. Now, it turns out that that's going to come under attack very quickly. But it's interesting how, after affirming this epistemological individualism, Locke comes back to an authoritative text and tries to find a new basis for believing it. But the problem is, and here's the abiding problem of Locke's philosophy, once you formulate this evidence...
Well, let's get back to the miracles of the Bible and what... Let me pull up the other PowerPoint. The miracles of the Bible. So this miracles of the Bible, again, if you watch the video, I'm going to have them all queued up. I'm going to separate them a little bit, I think, for YouTube, because when I stuff a little too much down your throat, folks can't digest it. This evidentialism, this concordism, this pattern that we see Jordan Peterson using. The walled garden is chaos, and here's the picture of the walled garden and chaos. And so what's going on here? The miracles of the Bible are evidence. Well, what happens later, obviously, is that the miracles of the Bible lead to skepticism. We would have rather had a text where there are no miracles, even though if you read broadly in the ancient world, you'll find miracles in texts that we derive all kinds of other historical information from. And so then we begin to ask, well, what is it with our biases about miracles? Well, now we're knocking on Jung's door again. And in a previous video, I mentioned, part of what Freud and Jung battle over are the reports in the bookshelf and the breaking of the table and Jung, Jung talking about supernatural things with his classmates, about ghosts with his classmates, and his classmates are like, well, we don't want to talk about this. They're embarrassed. Well, what's going on here with us? And obviously, what you find is that, well, people aren't embarrassed to talk about these things in certain contexts, and they're terribly embarrassed to talk about them in other contexts. Well, why? And this, of course, is, I think, part of the reason that Peterson has the stigma of Jung on him, because Peterson is willing to talk about this stuff. And where, Brett Weinstein comes into the Joe Rogan conversation with Jordan Peterson and says, yeah, I wanted to talk to you about this Bible stuff because, we don't like going here. Oh, okay. I get that. Groups have their biases all the time. Every group does. Christians do too. And so when you mention Jung amongst Christians, a lot of Christians say, ooh, I don't want to go by Jung. And there are some reasons for that. The young woman doing some videos that made a comment in my video, on one of my videos, and I looked up her channel, and Yeah, many Christians, it's a shibboleth. We see this and we say, oh, I don't want to go there. So, okay, well, that's fair enough. Nobody's going to tell me as a Christian pastor that there aren't places we shouldn't go. But at the same time, we should look at some of these things and understand them and say, well, where are we getting these biases from? Where are we getting these prejudices from? How do we bring in beliefs, and in what ways are they warranted, and whether or not we're going to have the courage to examine the tools by which we warrant them? And then you get just to the fact of human beings that, Luther and many others made the point that people believe what they want to believe. And then they make up reasons after it. Now we're talking about Jonathan Haidt. So in other words, all of this stuff that we're digging up with Peterson and Haidt, and this is why I find this tremendously fun, because when Jordan Peterson begins his biblical series and says nobody is educated enough to do a series on the psychological significance of the Bible, I say, amen. That is right. None of us are educated enough. I'm not educated enough. Just digging into this stuff, I have to self-educate. And, I have a degree of history, and then my degree in divinity, which is kind of a smorgasbord degree with some philosophy and all of this stuff. But even talking about Peterson, I have to go back and say, I need to retake my courses in philosophy that I took as an undergrad. And I've got to dig up Nick Waltersdorf and Alvin Plantinga, and I've got to learn about Piaget and Jung, and I've got to figure all this stuff out, because in this complex world, if I really want to get my handle on it to my own satisfaction, I can't just look at Jordan Peterson and say, oh, he's giving answers I don't like, so I'm not going to listen to him. I'd rather look at him and say, boy, he's opening up doors that are opening up possibilities. And, well, then Christians will say, well, yeah, but isn't this dangerous? I say, yeah, so I need companions. And so who's my companion going to be? Well, I've decided that C.S. Lewis is a good companion for this, because C.S. Lewis knows way more about all of this stuff than I ever will. And C.S. Lewis knows about mythology better than I ever will. In fact, he tried Until We Have Faces to write, in a sense, a modern fairy tale. And so then you say, well, why these people? Well, because of the church. The church? What does the church have to do with this? Well, the church has everything to do with this, because the church is my community, and the church offers me people I can trust in. Well, does that mean the church does everything right? No, it doesn't. Does that mean just because someone is a church person, they get everything right? No, surely not. It's certainly not true of me. But here, again, we can begin to find friends and say, how can I walk through these ideas and find people I can talk to? So let's finish up, Carrie.
This evidentialism, this notion that you don't have a right to a belief unless you have evidence for it, then it can be used not only against Quakers and other less than respectable religious sects. It can also be used against respectable religion. Locke didn't expect this. Locke figured that the mainstream Christian tradition, represented by Anglicanism in the Church of England, would survive the evidentialist challenge, right? That we had evidence for the truth of mainstream Christianity in these miracles recorded in the Gospels. But it turns out that as soon as you start using this evidentialist criterion, this notion you've got to proportion the strength of your belief to the strength of the evidence, you can certainly turn it against respectable religion too. You can turn it against all sorts of things which Locke did not expect to happen. So epistemological individualism tends to take a skeptical turn. It begins in a kind of skepticism with this doubting of everything by Descartes, and it makes so much dependent on what we can figure out that it results in a real crisis about the texts of the Western tradition, but also the key beliefs of the Western tradition. Can we find the evidence we need to believe in the ancient religion of the West, Christianity or Judaism? That becomes, I would argue, the key agony of modern religion for several hundred years.
And we're still in it. And this is exactly, again, why I'm preaching to the choir, I know, because only Jordan Peterson fans are going to watch this stuff. But this becomes why I think Peterson engages in these conversations in some new ways. And you might say, Now someone else out there who is more learned than I might say, "Well, no, nothing. This isn't anything to look at." But for me, no, these are the conversations we're having about. And Peterson brings it down to, well, what ought we to do with our lives? Francis Schaeffer, whose name I haven't brought up in any of this, how ought we to live? Francis Schaeffer, who a little different part of the tradition than myself, but who many young, restless, and reformed people tend to follow. But this is where we're at, and this is why, if we're going to be talking Jordan Peterson, know a little bit of Descartes, know a little bit of Locke, dig into some of this stuff. And again, part of what I'm going to use to undo Locke is going to be not only C.S. Lewis, but a little bit of Waltersdorf and planting it too. So here it is.